The Arizona Territory boiled under a sun that showed no mercy. It was a land of baked red earth and heat that shimmered off the ground in waves, a place where only the toughest things survived. It was 1873. The land didn't belong to anyone. It belonged to whoever was strong enough to hold it. Kaimana moved like a ghost through Shadow Canyon, the silence a lesson her mother had taught her before the soldiers came and burned the world down. She was there for the plants, the old medicine her grandmother swore by, the kind of knowledge that got you strange looks back at the agency settlement. The government men handed out rancid beef and counted heads, but they couldn't count the memories the land held. Kaimana wouldn't let them. She knelt by the spring, the water a cool blessing on her skin. She was about to fill her water skin when she heard it. A sound that didn't belong. It was a wet, ragged sound. The sound of breathing. The sound of dying. Her hand went to the knife at her belt. It had been her father's. She moved around a boulder, silent as the shadow she was named for, and saw him. A white man, crumpled against the canyon wall. His body was twisted at an angle that screamed of a long fall. A rancher, not a soldier. Denim pants, a cotton shirt soaked in sweat and a shocking amount of blood. His horse stood nearby, reins dragging, too well trained to run. White men were a fire you didn't get close to. She'd learned that watching her village turn to ash. But this one was alone. And dying. His eyes fluttered open as she approached. They were a startling gray-blue, the color of a summer creek. Pain was etched into his face, but his eyes were clear, focused. He coughed, and a spray of blood dotted his lips. A bad sign. An inside wound. She took a step closer, her mind a cold, flat stone of calculation. Leave him. Let him die, just like his people had left hers to die. It would be justice. It would be easy. But then he looked at her. He wasn't pleading. He wasn't demanding. He was just watching. As if he knew she held his life in her hands, and he had already made peace with her decision. That look broke something inside her. It reminded her of the warriors of her own tribe, facing the inevitable with a quiet dignity that defied their enemies. She knelt beside him. She couldn't let him die. Not like this. But what she didn't know was that saving him would be the biggest mistake of her life. His breathing was a shallow, clicking horror. Broken ribs, for sure. Maybe a punctured lung. She pulled out her father's knife and slit his shirt open. The bruising was already a violent purple spreading across his skin. A deep gash in his side wept blood, slow and steady. He'd bleed out in hours. She needed yarrow, comfrey, willow bark. The canyon would provide, but it would take time. Your horse, she said, her English thick but clear. Can it carry you? He managed a weak nod. Getting him on the horse was a nightmare. He was twice her weight, a dead weight of muscle and bone. She braced herself under his arm, taking his weight, and he let out a sound that wasn't human, a raw scream of agony torn from deep inside. But he stayed on his feet. Somehow, they got him sprawled belly down across the saddle. Good enough. She took the reins and led the horse deeper into the canyon, toward a hidden overhang no white man had ever seen. Every step was a fresh wave of doubt. Her people would call her a fool. The soldiers would call her worse. And the man himself? He might thank her by putting a bullet in her back the second he was strong enough. But she wouldn't become what she hated. She wouldn't let their cruelty poison her. She dragged his unconscious body into the shade of her hidden home and went to work. She gathered the herbs, her movements swift and sure. She built a small, smokeless fire. She cleaned the wound, packed it with yarrow, and bound his ribs tight with strips of his own shirt. She boiled willow bark into a bitter tea and dripped it between his lips. Night fell. The canyon filled with the cries of coyotes and the whisper of the wind. She sat with her back to the rock, her father's knife in her hand, and watched the stranger breathe. She must have dozed off, because the sky was gray with pre-dawn light when she opened her eyes again. He was awake, and he was watching her. "Where?" he rasped. "Safe," she said. "You fell. I brought you here." His eyes scanned the rock shelter, the bundles of herbs, her face. "You're Apache." It wasn't a question. "Yes. Why did you help me?" She thought of a dozen answers. About honor, about mercy, about defiance, but she gave him the simplest one. "Because you were dying." He held her gaze for a long moment, then closed his eyes, exhausted. But Kaimana saw something flicker in those creek blue eyes just before they closed. It wasn't gratitude, it was calculation, and a cold knot of fear tightened in her gut. This man was not what he seemed. His name, he told her the next day, was Nathan Carver. He owned a small ranch, 15 miles west. He'd been checking a fence line when a snake spooked his horse. A simple accident. A plausible story. It was a complete lie. Kaimana knew it was a lie because of what she'd found while cleaning his bloody clothes. Tucked deep inside a hidden pocket of his trousers was a small, oilskin pouch. Inside wasn't a wallet or a picture of a sweetheart. It was a silver badge, tarnished and worn, but the words were still clear. U.S. Marshal. This man wasn't a rancher. He was a lawman. And lawmen didn't come into Apache territory by accident. They came for a reason. They came for a person. Was he hunting someone? Or was he hunting her? She said nothing. She played the part of the simple healer, tending his wounds, bringing him food. She watched him, cataloging his every move, his every word, searching for a crack in his story. He was smart. He never let his guard down. He asked questions about her plants, about the canyon, but his eyes were always assessing, measuring. 3 days passed in this strange, silent war. She hunted rabbit with her bow. He watched her mend his torn shirt with a bone needle. A fragile, false peace settled over the small camp. On the 4th morning, he tried to stand. He hauled himself up against the rock wall, his face pale with pain. "Not yet," she said. "Your ribs need more time." "I have to get back," he gritted out. "People will be looking for me." "Then you'll die on the ride," she said flatly. "Sit." He surprised her by obeying. He sank back onto the sleeping robes, his breathing harsh. "You saved my life," he said, his eyes locking onto hers. "I owe you." "You owe me nothing." "Still," he pressed, "my ranch is a half-day's ride. You'd be welcome there. Anything you need." The offer hung in the air, slick and dangerous. A marshal offering shelter to an Apache woman who lived in hiding? It was a trap. It had to be. "I need nothing from your world," she said, her voice colder than the spring water. He nodded, a flicker of something, disappointment, frustration, in his eyes. "Fair enough, but the offer stands." The next day, he pushed it too far. She came back from checking her snares to find him trying to saddle his horse. He was swaying on his feet, his face gray. "Stubborn fool," she snapped, dropping her kill. "You'll tear your wounds open." "I can't stay here," he gasped, reaching for the heavy saddle again. His knees buckled. She caught him just before he hit the ground, his dead weight nearly crushing her. She dragged him back to the shelter, cursing him in Apache the whole way. His bandages were already seeping fresh blood. "You white people," she muttered, "so eager to die." "I'm not a burden," he panted, shame coloring his face. He thought he was weak for needing her help. "Strength is knowing when to rest," she told him, her voice softening despite herself. "Only fools confuse stubbornness with courage." Something in his face shifted. "You sound like my mother." It was a crack in his armor, an opening. "Tell me about your ranch," she said, her hands busy unwrapping his wound. She had to keep him talking. She had to find the truth. He told her about the cabin, the creek, the 100 head of cattle. He spoke with a genuine affection that almost made her believe him. Almost. He talked about his foreman, an old man named Marcus. He said he preferred the solitude to the noise of towns. It was a perfect story, told by a perfect liar. That night, under a blanket of stars, he asked about her life. An invasive question. But she saw her chance. She would trade a piece of her truth for a piece of his. She told him about her family. Her father, the great hunter. Her mother, the master weaver. And she told him about the day the soldiers came. The massacre at Canyon de Chelly. The forced march. The death. She left out one crucial detail, that she had escaped. That the agency considered her a runaway. A criminal. She watched his face in the firelight as she spoke, looking for any sign of recognition, any hint that he knew her story. But his expression was a mask of sympathy. He was good. Frighteningly good. When she finished, he was silent for a long time. Then he said, "Thank you for telling me." 4 simple words that felt like the most calculated lie of all. The very next morning he made his move. His strength was returning. The healing power of her medicine undeniable. She was checking his ribs when he caught her hand. "Come with me," he said, his voice low and urgent. "What?" "To the ranch. You can't live like this, hiding. You deserve a real home. Safety." The word hit her like a stone. Safety. The one thing a U.S. Marshal could offer. Or take away. She pulled her hand back, letting anger mask her fear. "You think I need rescuing? I have survived things you can't imagine. I am here because I choose to be." "That's not what I meant." "It is exactly what you meant," she shot back. "Poor Apache woman. Let the white man save you. I've heard that story before." His jaw tightened. "That's not what I'm offering." "Tomorrow," she said, her voice like ice, "you will ride home. Your wounds are healed enough. We are finished here." She walked away, her heart hammering against her ribs. The game had just escalated. He had shown his hand, and she had called his bluff. Now, she just had to survive the fallout. He left at dawn. He saddled his own horse, moving with a stiffness that was only partly feigned. He was still weak, but he was determined. He turned to her before mounting. "I'm grateful, Kaimana, and I'm sorry if I insulted you." "I know," she said, her face unreadable. He swung into the saddle, looking down at her. In his eyes, she saw a storm of emotions she couldn't begin to decipher. "Goodbye, Kaimana. Goodbye, Nathan Carver." She watched him ride west until he was just a speck against the red rock. Then she went back to her shelter and methodically erased every sign he had ever been there. She burned the bloody bandages, scrubbed the pot, scattered the ashes of his fires. The canyon was silent again, her sanctuary, her prison. But the silence was different now. It was heavier. It was filled with the echo of his lies and the weight of the silver badge she still held, wrapped in a piece of deerskin. 3 weeks crawled by. The nights grew colder. Autumn was bleeding into the land. Kaimana fell back into the rhythm of survival, but her senses were stretched tight. She scanned the canyon rim every morning and every night. She knew he would be back. Men like Nathan Carver didn't leave a job unfinished. She was roasting prickly pear pads over her fire when she heard it. Hoofbeats. A single rider, coming fast. She melted into the shadows, an arrow already nocked in her bow. He rode into the clearing, his horse lathered in sweat. He looked stronger, healed. But his face was tight with an anxiety that hadn't been there before. He wasn't playing a role now. This was real. She stepped into the light. The bow raised, the arrow pointed at his chest. He reined in his horse, his hands held high. "I come in peace." "Why do you come at all?" He dismounted slowly. "I had to see you. Kaimana, you're in danger." "From you?" she asked, her voice flat. "No," he said, taking a cautious step forward. "From them. My people. They know you're here." It was another lie, but a different kind. He was trying to scare her, trying to make her run to him for protection. "I can take care of myself," she said. "Not against them," he insisted. His eyes were wild. "Look, I messed up. I didn't tell you the whole truth. I'm not just a rancher." He reached into his coat. She tensed, her fingers tightening on the bowstring. But he didn't pull out a gun. He pulled out a piece of paper. A wanted poster. He unfolded it and held it up. It was a crude drawing, but the face was unmistakable. It was her, Kaimana. Wanted for fleeing the San Carlos reservation. For theft of government supplies. For assaulting an agency officer. All lies fabricated to justify a bounty. They hired me to bring you in, he said, his voice cracking. That's why I was out here. I was tracking you. The truth, finally, cold and ugly. It settled in her stomach like a shard of ice. He hadn't stumbled upon her. He had hunted her. The fall, she whispered. The snake. There was no snake, he admitted, his face etched with shame. Someone else is after you. Someone who knew I was closing in. They ambushed me on the rim. They thought the fall would kill me. A new player. The game had just gotten deadlier. Who? I don't know. But they're not lawmen. They were rough, and they wanted you alive. He took another step, his hands still empty, open. Kaimana, I came back to warn you. I tore up my contract. I'm not taking you in. But they're coming. We have to go. Now. She stared at him, at the wanted poster with her own face on it, at the earnest desperation in his eyes. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to disappear deeper into the wilderness where no one could find her. But for the first time, she saw a glimmer of honesty in Nathan Carver. He was a liar and a hunter. But he was also a man who had been left for dead by a common enemy. An enemy that was coming for her. He was offering a truce. An alliance. And as the distant sound of more hoofbeats echoed from the mouth of the canyon, she realized she had no other choice. Get down, she hissed, grabbing his arm and pulling him behind the massive boulder at the edge of her camp. The riders entered the canyon. There were 3 of them, hard men with rifles resting across their saddles. The man in the lead was big and thick-shouldered, with small, mean eyes. She recognized him instantly. Dutch. A ranch hand from the Carver Ranch, the one Nathan had mentioned. But he wasn't looking for his boss. He was looking for her. Spread out, Dutch yelled to his men. The marshal said she's got a hideout near the spring. Find her. The boss wants her alive. Kaimana looked at Nathan, his face grim in the shadows. Your own man? He's not my man, Nathan whispered back, his hand instinctively going to the empty holster at his hip. His gun must have been lost in the fall. He works for me, but he's always been loyal to another name. Blackwood. Cyrus Blackwood. A land baron who was swallowing up the territory piece by piece, using hired thugs like Dutch to do his dirty work. Why does Blackwood want me? Kaimana breathed. I don't know, Nathan said. But my ranch is the only one in this valley Blackwood hasn't been able to buy or scare off. Maybe this has something to do with that. One of Dutch's men was getting closer to their position. He dismounted, his boots crunching on the gravel. Kaimana drew her father's knife. Nathan picked up a heavy, jagged rock. They were outmanned, outgunned, and trapped. The man rounded the boulder. His eyes widened in surprise as he saw them. He opened his mouth to shout. Kaimana moved first. She lunged forward, not with the knife, but with her feet. She kicked his legs out from under him, sending him sprawling. Nathan was on him in a flash, the jagged rock raised high. The man didn't make a sound as Nathan brought it down, 1 down, 2 to go. He'll have this, Nathan said, pulling a pistol from the unconscious man's holster and checking the cylinder. Let's even the odds. But Dutch had heard the scuffle. Jed, what was that? Silence. Jed, Dutch barked, pulling his rifle from its scabbard. Find them. The hunt was on. Kaimana grabbed her bow. This was her canyon, her territory. She knew every rock, every shadow. She faded back into a narrow crevice while Nathan took cover, the new pistol held steady in his hand. The second man came looking, moving carelessly, thinking he was hunting a lone woman. Kaimana drew her bowstring back. The arrow was a silent prayer. She aimed not to kill, but to cripple. The arrow hissed through the air and buried itself in the man's thigh. He screamed, dropping his rifle and clutching his leg. Dutch whirled around, firing blindly in her direction. Bullets ricocheted off the canyon walls. Come on out, squaw, he roared. Blackwood wants to ask you some questions. That's when Nathan stepped out from behind his rock. He can ask me instead, Dutch. Dutch's face went slack with shock. Carver, you're supposed to be dead. Funny, Nathan said, leveling the pistol. I was just thinking the same thing about you. You were a loose end, boss, Dutch sneered, recovering his composure. He slowly raised his rifle. Blackwood pays better than you do anyway. What does he want with her? Nathan demanded. She knows something, Dutch said, his eyes flicking toward the shadows where Kaimana was hiding. Something about this land, something her grandmother taught her, something Blackwood is willing to pay a fortune for. Her grandmother, the medicine woman. She knew the secrets of every plant, every rock, every hidden spring in this territory. What had she known that a man like Blackwood would kill for? Before Nathan could ask another question, Dutch made his move. He dropped to one knee and fired his rifle. But he wasn't aiming at Nathan. He was aiming at Kaimana. Nathan fired the pistol at the same instant, his bullet tearing through Dutch's shoulder. Dutch screamed in pain, his own shot going wide, smashing into the rock just inches from Kaimana's head. The other wounded man was trying to get to his rifle. Kaimana knocked another arrow, her hands steady. The standoff was a stalemate. A wounded Dutch, a man with an arrow in his leg, and a half-healed marshal against an Apache warrior in her own domain. Dutch clutched his bleeding shoulder, his face a mask of fury. This ain't over, Carver. Blackwood will get what he wants. He always does. He scrambled back to his horse, helped his whimpering man into the saddle, and galloped away, leaving the unconscious Jed behind. The canyon was suddenly, terrifyingly quiet. Kaimana stepped out of the shadows, her bow still in her hand. She and Nathan looked at each other, the wanted poster lying forgotten in the dust between them. He wasn't her enemy anymore. But he wasn't her savior either. They were something else entirely. They were survivors, and they were partners in a war they had just declared on the most dangerous man in Arizona. What did your grandmother know? Nathan asked, his voice low. Kaimana thought of her grandmother's stories, whispered by the fire. Stories of a hidden place, a canyon where the water ran yellow and the rocks shimmered with a strange metal. A place the old ones called the sun's tears. Gold. Cyrus Blackwood wasn't after her for knowledge of plants. He was after a map that only existed in her memory. She knew where to find something that drives men like Blackwood mad, Kaimana said. Nathan's face was grim. My ranch. It's on the edge of that territory, isn't it? The land your grandmother talked about. She nodded. It all made sense now. Blackwood didn't just want Nathan's ranch. He wanted the land it bordered. He wanted her to lead him to the gold. They'll be back, Nathan said, with more men. This place is not safe anymore. Neither is my ranch, he said. Not for you, not alone. He looked at her, his marshal's mask stripped away, leaving only a man in an impossible situation. Kaimana, I was a soldier, before I was a marshal. I was at Canyon de Chelly. The words hit her like a physical blow. She stared at him, the canyon walls seeming to close in around her. I didn't... He struggled, his voice thick with a shame that was years old. I didn't fire a shot. I saw what they were doing, and I deserted that night. That's why I became a marshal. To try and balance the scales. To find some kind of justice in this damned country. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small oilskin pouch she had found. He opened it, but instead of the badge, he pulled out a small, intricately beaded amulet. An Apache morning star. This belonged to a warrior there, he said softly. I took it. To remember. To never forget what I ran from. Kaimana stared at the amulet. Her breath caught in her throat. She had seen it before, hanging around her father's neck. The world tilted on its axis. This man, her enemy, her ally. He was tied to her past in a way she could never have imagined. He had been there. He had witnessed her world burn, and he carried its last remnant in his pocket. The choice before her was no longer about survival. It was about something far more complicated. Vengeance. Forgiveness. Trust. We can't stay here, she said, her voice hollow. And we can't go to your ranch. It's the first place they'll look. I have a place, Nathan said. A line cabin, high in the mountains, miles from the ranch. It's remote, defensible. Marcus is the only one who knows where it is. We can hide there. We can plan. She looked from the amulet in his hand to the determination in his eyes. He had hunted her. He had lied to her. He was a part of the world that had destroyed hers. But he had also taken a bullet for her. And his enemies were now her enemies. "One more thing," Nathan said, taking a step closer. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a bundle wrapped in cloth. He held it out to her. Inside was a knife. A magnificent hunting knife with a handle of carved bone and a blade of polished steel. "My father was a blacksmith," he said. "He made this. It's the best blade I've ever owned. I want you to have it." He was trying to replace her father's knife with one of his own. The symbolism was as sharp as the blade itself. A new weapon, a new alliance. She took the knife. Its weight was perfect in her hand. "We leave now," she said. They tied up the unconscious bounty hunter and left him by the spring with a full water skin. They took his horse, his rifle, and his ammunition. As they rode out of Shadow Canyon, leaving her only home behind, Kaimana didn't look back. The past was a ghost. The future was a war. And she was riding into it beside a man who was both her greatest enemy and her only hope. The mountain cabin was a fortress. Tucked into a narrow pass with sheer rock on 3 sides, it offered a commanding view of the only approach. It was small, barely 1 room, but the logs were thick, and the stone chimney drew well. For 2 days they worked, turning the small cabin into a bunker. They felled trees to create a barricade, set snares and deadfalls along the trail, and rationed their small supply of ammunition. A strange intimacy grew between them, forged in shared labor and constant danger. The lies had been burned away, leaving only a raw, desperate truth. They were 2 broken people from warring worlds, bound together by a common threat. He taught her how to reload his pistol. She taught him which mushrooms were safe to eat and which would kill a man in minutes. He talked about his shame, the ghosts from Canyon de Chelly that haunted his sleep. She talked about her grandmother's wisdom, the stories of the land that were her only inheritance. She still held his secret, the amulet that had belonged to her father. She kept it hidden, a cold weight against her skin. She didn't know why she didn't confront him with it. Perhaps she was afraid of the answer. Perhaps, in some small, terrified part of her heart, she didn't want this fragile truce to shatter. On the 3rd night, the first snow of winter began to fall. They sat by the fire, the wind howling outside, the world shrinking to the 4 walls of the cabin. "He'll send Marcus," Nathan said, staring into the flames. "Blackwood. He'll go to the ranch and force Marcus to tell him where I am." "Will he talk?" Kaimana asked. "Marcus?" Nathan gave a grim smile. "He's stubborn as a mule and twice as mean. Blackwood will have to kill him to get the information. And he will." A plan began to form in Kaimana's mind, born of Apache tactics. "We don't wait for them to come to us," she said. "We go to them." "It's suicide," he said. "There will be too many of them." "We don't fight them," she explained. "We hunt them. We separate them. This is my land. These mountains. I know paths that aren't on any white man's map. We can lead them into traps. We can pick them off, one by one." It was a guerrilla war she was proposing, a war of ghosts and shadows. He looked at her, at the firelight dancing in her dark eyes. He saw not a victim, not a savage, but a warrior, a strategist, a leader. "All right," he said, his voice filled with a new respect. "We hunt." The next day, they left the cabin and moved higher into the mountains, becoming wraiths in the swirling snow. They found the tracks of Blackwood's men within hours. A dozen riders, led by Dutch, his arm in a sling. They were following Nathan's trail from the canyon, heading straight for the ranch. "They've got Marcus," Nathan said, his voice tight with fury. The tracks showed a single horse being led, its rider clearly bound. "They're moving slow," Kaimana observed. "Confident. They think we're running." "Let them," Nathan said, a cold light in his eyes. That night, Kaimana slipped into their camp like smoke. She moved between the sleeping sentries, her new knife in one hand, a small pouch in the other. She didn't kill anyone. She cut saddle girths until they were hanging by a thread. She took their spare ammunition, and she left a single perfect eagle feather on Dutch's chest. A warning. A promise. The next morning, the pursuit fell into chaos. Saddles slipped, sending riders tumbling. The discovery of the missing ammunition sent a wave of paranoia through the men. The eagle feather sent Dutch into a rage. He knew they were being watched. He knew they were being hunted. They split the party. Dutch and 5 men would press onto the ranch with Marcus. The other 5 would sweep the mountains, searching for the ghosts that were tormenting them. It was exactly what Kaimana had wanted. She and Nathan drew the 5 searchers into a box canyon. A rock slide, carefully prepared, sealed the entrance behind them. They were trapped. "Now what?" Nathan whispered, crouched beside her on the canyon rim. "Now we wait," she said. For 2 days, they held them there. They never showed themselves. They used the wind to carry the sounds of a woman crying, then a man screaming. They used her bow to send arrows with burning messages into the camp, promising a slow death. They turned the mountains themselves into a weapon of psychological terror. By the 3rd day, the men were turning on each other, their nerves shattered. 2 of them tried to climb the canyon walls. They fell. The other 3 surrendered, throwing down their weapons and begging for their lives. Kaimana and Nathan left them there, disarmed and terrified, and went after Dutch. They reached the Carver Ranch at dusk. It looked like an armed camp. Blackwood's men were everywhere. Lights burned in the main house and the barn. And in the center of the corral, tied to a post, was Marcus. His face was bruised and bloody, but he was still defiant, spitting curses at his captors. Dutch was standing over him, a bucket of freezing water in his hand. "Last chance, old man. Where's the mountain cabin?" Marcus just laughed, a raw, painful sound. Dutch threw the water on him. Marcus shuddered violently, the icy shock stealing his breath. "Inside," Nathan whispered, his knuckles white around his rifle. "Blackwood must be in the house." "There's a root cellar," Kaimana said, remembering his description. "The entrance is behind the main house. Does it connect?" "Yes," Nathan breathed, his eyes lighting up. "Under the floorboards in the kitchen pantry." They slipped through the darkness, moving from shadow to shadow. They found the cellar door, half hidden by overgrown bushes. It was unlocked. The air inside was cold and smelled of earth and potatoes. They moved through the darkness until they were under the house. They could hear the heavy tread of boots on the floorboards above, the murmur of voices. They found the trapdoor to the pantry. Nathan pushed it up an inch. They could see into the main room. Cyrus Blackwood sat at Nathan's table as if he owned it. He was a big man, dressed in a fine suit that looked out of place in the rustic cabin. He was sipping whiskey, a map spread out on the table before him. Dutch stood beside him. "He's not breaking," Dutch said. "The old man is tougher than he looks." "Then we'll provide him with some motivation," Blackwood said with a thin smile. "Go get the Apache woman's things from the marshal's saddlebags. The ones he was carrying. Let's see if the old man recognizes any of it. Remind him what happens to people who get in my way." Dutch left the room. Nathan and Kaimana exchanged a look of confusion. Nathan hadn't been carrying any of her things. Dutch returned and dropped a bundle on the table. Kaimana's blood ran cold. It was her grandmother's medicine basket, her mother's sleeping robe, the things she had left behind in Shadow Canyon. Blackwood's men hadn't just been hunting her. They had found her home. They had desecrated it. But that wasn't the worst part. Blackwood reached into the basket and pulled out an object wrapped in deerskin. He unwrapped it. It was the Silver Marshal's badge. "Our friend Carver was smarter than you gave him credit for, Dutch," Blackwood said, turning the badge over in his fingers. "He wasn't just tracking the girl. He was investigating me. It seems the federal government is finally taking an interest in my business practices." He looked up, a cruel smile playing on his lips. He thought the girl was his key to finding my weakness. He never realized, she is my weakness. Kaimana stared at Nathan in the darkness of the cellar, 1,000 questions in her eyes. He had lied again. He wasn't a deserter who became a marshal for justice. He was an investigator, undercover, using her as bait to get to Blackwood. But before she could process the betrayal, Blackwood delivered the final, devastating blow. "Her grandmother made a deal with me years ago," Blackwood said, his voice dripping with condescension. She showed me where the gold was. In exchange, I promised to protect her people from the army. A promise I, of course, had no intention of keeping. He laughed. The old woman realized her mistake too late. She tried to hide the location, created a new map coded in the stars and the seasons, and taught it only to her granddaughter. A map this girl doesn't even know she has. He leaned forward, his eyes gleaming. Bring the girl to me. She will unlock her grandmother's secrets. Or she'll watch everyone she's ever cared about die, starting with that old man in the yard. The betrayal was absolute. Her grandmother, a traitor. Nathan, a liar. Her entire life, her entire history, had been a lie. Twisted and manipulated by the greed of this one man. Rage, pure and cleansing, burned away her fear. She looked at Nathan. He wouldn't meet her eyes. The shame on his face was real this time. She put her hand on his arm. Her touch was not forgiving. It was a command. "We end this now," she whispered. She slipped her father's amulet from around her neck and pressed it into his hand. "Give this back to its owner," she said, her voice like flint. Then, she pushed open the trapdoor and rose from the floor like a spirit of vengeance. Her father's knife and Nathan's knife in her hands, ready to reclaim her story. Blackwood's head snapped up, his eyes wide with shock. Dutch fumbled for his pistol. "Looking for me?" Kaimana asked, her voice calm and deadly. From the front door, a rifle shot exploded. Dutch cried out and crumpled to the floor, shot through the leg by Marcus, who had chewed through his ropes and been freed by one of the ranch hands who had finally chosen a side. Nathan vaulted out of the cellar behind Kaimana, his pistol leveled at Blackwood. The other ranch hands, Esteban and the Texans, burst in through the back door, their own guns drawn. Blackwood's men were caught completely by surprise, trapped and surrounded. "It's over, Blackwood," Nathan said, his voice ringing with authority. "You're under arrest for fraud, murder, and conspiracy against the United States government." Blackwood stared at Kaimana, at the two knives in her hands, at the fire in her eyes. He knew he was beaten. But he made one last, desperate move. He grabbed the heavy whiskey bottle from the table and lunged, not at Nathan, but at her. Kaimana didn't flinch. She moved with a speed born of a lifetime of survival. She sidestepped his clumsy attack, brought the hilt of her father's knife up under his chin, and used his own momentum to slam his head back against the stone fireplace. He collapsed in a heap, unconscious. Silence descended on the room, broken only by the ragged sound of breathing. Kaimana stood over the man who had destroyed her family, her home, her history. Justice had been served. Not by a lawman's bullet, but by an Apache's strength. She turned to face Nathan. The room was full of people, but they were the only two in the world. He was still holding her father's amulet. He looked from it to her, his face a canvas of regret. "I was going to tell you," he whispered. "Everything." "I know," she said. And to her own surprise, she realized it was true. His lies had been a weapon, but he had aimed them at Blackwood, not at her. He had used her, yes, but he had also protected her, fought for her. He had seen her as a person when the rest of the world saw only a savage or a tool. He held out the amulet. "This belongs to you." She looked at the small beaded star. It was a symbol of a past that was gone forever, a father she could barely remember. Then she looked at the two knives in her own hands. One from her father, a legacy of survival. One from Nathan, a promise of a future. She did not have to choose. She could carry them both. "No," she said, her voice clear and strong. "It belongs to a man who saw an injustice and tried to make it right. It belongs to you." She walked out of the house and into the cold, clean night, leaving him standing there with the weight of her forgiveness in his hand. She went to the corral and began to tend to Marcus's wounds. Winter held the ranch in its grip, but it was a time of healing. Blackwood and his men were hauled away in chains by a troop of cavalry Nathan sent for. The ranch was quiet again, peaceful. Kaimana did not return to a hidden cabin. She stayed. She had her own room in the main house, a space that was hers alone. She and Nathan orbited each other in a careful dance of unspoken truths. The war was over, but the peace was fragile. One day, as the first signs of spring began to thaw the land, he found her by the creek. "I never got to ask," he said. "The question Blackwood was willing to kill for. Do you know the map? Do you know where the sun's tears are hidden?" Kaimana looked at the rolling grasslands, the distant mountains where she had been born. The gold had been a curse on her family, on her people. It had brought nothing but greed and death. "Some secrets," she said, "are meant to stay with the land." She was letting it go, the past, the gold, the anger. Nathan nodded, understanding. "The land can keep it," he said. He looked at her, and this time, there were no lies in his eyes, no secrets, only a deep and abiding respect. "Kaimana, whatever I was when I came to that canyon, a marshal, a soldier, I'm not that man anymore. You changed me." "And you," she admitted, "are not the man I thought you were." He took a step closer. "I would be honored," he said, his voice hesitant, "if you would consider staying. Not as a guest, as a partner, in this ranch, in this life." She looked at their reflection in the clear, cold water of the creek, an Apache warrior and a white lawman. Two worlds, scarred by the same history, standing together. They were a contradiction, an impossibility. And yet, here they were. "This life," she said, a small smile touching her lips for the first time in a lifetime, "is something we built together. I think I will stay to see how it grows." They built a new world on that small patch of land, a world that honored both of their pasts while creating a future all their own. It wasn't easy. The ghosts were always there, but they faced them together. They proved that home wasn't something you find, but something you build, something you fight for. What do you think is the strongest foundation for a new beginning, forgiveness or justice? The story of Kaimana and Nathan shows that maybe you need a little bit of both. If you enjoyed this story of survival and redemption, don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales from the forgotten corners of history.